We're going to start a section today on mechanism. Remember, this is one of Tinbergen's 4 different types of questions, or as he called it, levels of analysis. And I'm going to stick with the term mechanism because, I don't know, for some reason I like it a little bit more. I'll probably use it a little more often. But I do want to remind you that the other term for this is immediate stimuli. Now, there are a few different kinds of mechanisms we're going to be talking about. So we're starting out with hormones, which is why this has this little subtitle. Before we go into hormones, I just want to review another Tinbergen set of terms, which is proximate and ultimate causes of behavior. These are odd ideas, so that's why I kind of take an extra moment to review them a couple of times through this class, just because you might not have thought of things this way before. Remember, Tinbergen said that we can divide up these 4 major questions into 2 even bigger categories, which is categories of the cause of a behavior. We already talked a little bit about ultimate causes of behavior. Ultimate causes are those more long-term, multi-generational topics that relate to why an animal behaves the way it does. This is where we were talking about function of a behavior, which would be true for many generations of animals, and also where we talked about evolutionary process, right? The evolutionary piece of behavior, how behaviors have changed over time. Those are both big, ultimate kinds of questions. So we're now shifting back to proximate causes, which are a little more short-term or in the moment. We have 2 different types of proximate causes. The first one listed here is what we're going to be talking about now. Our mechanisms are also called immediate stimuli. These are the things that trigger an individual behavioral bout. So why are you coughing right now? What's causing you to cough at this moment? What's causing you to sneeze at this moment? What's causing you to smile in this moment? Right? So these are very short-term causes. The other kind of proximate cause, which we're going to get to next, is development. So this is still talking about one individual animal's lifetime, but instead of being just about the moment, it's about the development over some portion of the lifespan, right? So how does a behavior develop? How does it change from childhood to adulthood, for example? We're going to get to that, but first we're going to talk about some examples of mechanisms or immediate stimuli. And we're going to be even more specific than that. We're going to talk about internal mechanisms, meaning things within the body of the animal itself that can trigger or influence a behavior to occur. Not all mechanisms are internal. We can have an external mechanism. For example, maybe I see my best friend and it's the sight of my best friend that's triggering a smile. And maybe I want to study that, how the thing in my environment is triggering behaviors. That would still be mechanism. But for right now, we're going to talk about stuff in the body, right? And the 3 different kinds of internal mechanisms we're going to discuss are hormones, neurobiology, and molecular genetics. Now, we could spend entire multi-semesters on each one of these types of topics and how they influence behavior. I do not expect you to go that deep into any of these. We're just going to kind of skim the surface, maybe have a couple of specific examples, but really, that's it. So it's going to be pretty light. For this little section of video, we're going to specifically focus on hormones. Then I'll make up 2 other short videos, one on neurobiology and one on molecular genetics. So we hit a little bit on each of them. Now, if you haven't thought about hormones in a very long time, or even if you've thought about them but you feel a little rusty, this is where you're going to go back to your textbook, review some of the basics of hormones that would be assumed that you're kind of familiar with. To understand how much you should know, review the basics, page 81 to 84, and that will give you a good grounding in it. What I want to talk a little bit about today are the many different ways that hormones can actually affect behavior. One way that hormones can affect behavior is they truly can modify an ongoing behavior. So the presence of a hormone or the change in hormone levels, maybe the hormone's always present, but you get a spike of a little more of it. Modify behavior means that behavior is already going on, but it changes in some way. So for example, you might already be breathing, but a hormone surge could cause you to breathe faster or breathe slower. In either of those cases, it's not that it started a new behavior. We were already breathing, but it's modified it. It's changed the rate, it's changed in intensity, it's changed something about it, right? So it's still going on, just in a little bit different way. That's a pretty common effect that hormones can have on behaviors, is not even just to trigger them, but to modify them. However, triggering a behavior is also a possible effect on behavior. So we have that here. It is possible that a change in hormone level can trigger the onset or the start of a behavior. So this is another way that hormones can have an effect on behavior. We have a third way, which is they can prime for behaviors. What this means is a change in hormone levels can prime an animal so that they are more or less likely to behave in a certain way. This is much more subtle than triggering the behavior, right? If you have a hormone surge and it automatically triggers a behavior, it either happens or it doesn't. Here, though, we're just saying it makes you more or less likely to do a behavior. It's not a guarantee that a behavior will happen or won't happen. Let me give you an example of this one from real life. Testosterone is a hormone I'm guessing most of you have heard of, right? The presence of high levels of testosterone in male animals in many species will make the male more likely to perform aggressive behaviors. This is true of a lot of animals, including some we might be pretty familiar with, like humans. The presence of higher levels of testosterone in males make them more likely to perform aggressive behaviors. Notice, it doesn't guarantee it. You can have males of many species who have very high levels of testosterone who are not behaving in an aggressive manner. You can also have males of many species who have relatively low levels of testosterone who are behaving in an aggressive way. It's just priming or making it more likely to happen. There's something interesting that goes on with this priming as well that we call a feedback loop. A feedback loop can happen when you have hormones that are priming for behaviors, and it's called a loop because it continues the cycle over and over again. For example, with testosterone, higher levels of testosterone do tend to prime a male animal for aggressive behaviors. One example of this aggressive behavior is that animals, specifically males with higher levels of testosterone, are more likely to challenge another male to a fight. We've studied this extensively in rats and mice, and what we see is if you have high levels of testosterone, you're more likely to challenge to a fight. Also, if you have higher levels of testosterone, you're more likely to win the fight. If you win a fight, winning a fight causes a surge in testosterone, which, again, a surge would be a higher level of testosterone. What does a higher level of testosterone cause? Causes you to fight more. When you fight and you win, it causes a surge in testosterone, pushing you to engage in another fight. This is why we call it a feedback loop. The hormone causes you to do a behavior, and the outcome of that behavior increases that original hormone, which makes you more likely to do that behavior again. And if you do that behavior, it can increase the hormone, which makes it more likely to do the behavior again in a loop, right? We see this with a number of different kinds of hormones, but that's the one that you'd probably be most familiar with. Also interesting, if you study animals and animal behavior, you're more likely to do some things like directly manipulate hormones. And here's one. We have directly manipulated the winning and losing of mice as they battle each other. We have lots of ways. It sounds very manipulative and kind of conniving, and I guess it sort of is, because we're making rats or mice lose a fight they should have won or win a fight they should have lost, and then we watch what happens to their testosterone levels. And so if we kind of step in, we do find that if we manipulate it so that a mouse or a rat loses a fight, we see a drop in testosterone, whether we caused them to lose or if they would have lost anyway. Same that happens for causing them to win. We see this spike in testosterone. It's interesting stuff. And if you like manipulating things like animals, I suppose it could be an interesting way to go for your own kind of research, huh? Now, not everything has to do with testosterone, but it's a really good example of how you can be primed to act or more likely to act in one way than another. Finally, hormones can also affect behavior. They can also have an effect on behavior in a little more long-term way, that they can influence what we call the organization of behaviors. Well, what do we mean by the organization of behaviors? During early development, hormone presence and levels of hormones have major effects on the development of an animal. These developmental effects can have long-lasting impact on behavior. This is where hormones start to move from strictly being about the mechanism in the moment and more of a long-term developmental effect. So we're kind of combining both of our two proximate level topics here, right? We're going to go in class over an example of this organization of behaviors. It's one that's in your book that has to do with what's called the intrauterine effect. So when you read in your textbook and you get to that intrauterine effect, pay attention to that. Think about it. Think about any questions you might have, because we're going to go over that example in class. I did want to go over one specific example of some hormones that will have effects on behavior, either modifying or triggering or priming behaviors. And specifically, I wanted to talk a moment about fight or flight behaviors. So I'm guessing you guys have heard of the fight or flight response, right? This humans experience it, many animals experience it. The idea of the fight or flight response is that your body is very well built to respond in many different ways when it is in the presence of a potential threat, right? We called it originally the fight or flight response because the two responses or big classes of responses we focused on is that your body might be priming to fight, directly challenge whatever that potential threat is, or flee, right? Run away, get away from the danger. We've now actually expanded it, but it's a lot to say. The third F actually is freeze. The fight, flight, or freeze response, because we've really recognized that a third kind of strategy for there may be a potential threat is to simply freeze and shut down, staying as still as you can, and hopefully the threat just doesn't even notice you. So that's a third, very legitimate in many cases, kind of response to danger. So let's talk for a minute about think for a minute about what the fight or flight response is. Imagine we've got two lions and they're like gearing up for a fight, right? So this is going to be, or fleeing, we just see one threatening the other. We see a huge cascade of changes in the body. We tend to see, and this is true also if it's humans, we tend to see an increase in heart rate and an increase in breathing. Think for a minute about why we would want that. If we need to either fight or run away, why do we want increase in heart rate? Why do we want increase in breathing? These are actually very tied to each other. If we're going to have to fight or run away, we're going to need our muscles to be working sort of their optimal. To get our muscles working at their best, they're going to need energy and they're going to need oxygen. So we increase our breathing so that we have plenty of oxygen to get to all those muscles that need to work hard. We increase our heart rate because it's our blood that's going to deliver some kind of energy, nutrients, right? We're going to break down some of that stored energy we have in our body and get it to those muscles so that they can move and fight or run away, right? Fight or flight. We also tend to see a shutting down of any non-essential systems in our body. Think your gut. If you had just been eating a meal, if you were one of these lions, maybe you were eating something, when it's time to fight, you don't want to waste any energy on absorbing and digesting, breaking down that meal. That can wait for later. So we're going to shut down non-essential items. We're going to want to not feel pain, or at least not quite as much as we usually do. Why? I think this one makes sense, right? If I'm feeling so much pain that it's distracting me while I'm in the middle of my fight, I stop and say, ow, that really, really hurt, you guys. I'm going to get killed, right? We don't want to be distracted by low-level pain because our body is assuming this is a life or death situation. So we need to just flee no matter how much something hurts, or fight through the pain. And once the situation is settled, then we can deal with those injuries. But we don't want those signals distracting us right now. Let's see. What else? Oh, let's see. I think a few others might come up with our specific hormones. And if they don't, I'm going to add them in. I wanted to tell you about just a couple specific systems of hormones and exactly what those hormones are doing, what mechanism role they're playing, right? We won't have a lot, but make sure you're familiar with these names, okay? When an animal detects something dangerous, its changes in the circulating hormones are what drive the fight or flight response. Here's something to make sure you remember. Hormones will move through your body in your bloodstream. Hormones are produced in your body by something called glands. I think you guys know this. We all have lots of different glands and systems of glands throughout our body, and some of them produce different things than others. So here's a couple I want you to be familiar with. One is the adrenal gland. One of the things the adrenal gland produces is epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline. I'm guessing some of you are more familiar with the name adrenaline than epinephrine. Here's a funny thing. Well, at least I think it's kind of funny. If you're in the UK, this thing is always called epinephrine. They don't use the term adrenaline at all. Here in the US, if this chemical is found in your nervous system as a neurotransmitter, it's called epinephrine. If it's found in your circulating bloodstream, if it's a hormone, it's called adrenaline. The chemical is identical. It's not different. We just give it a different name because we've decided we want to know which part of the body we're in. So if you'd like to, think of it as adrenaline, that works to me. What does adrenaline do? Actually, adrenaline, epinephrine, does some of the same things as norepinephrine, which is why I have both of them here. But norepinephrine or noradrenaline is not nearly as important as the epinephrine piece. Some of the things that happen when you have adrenaline in your bloodstream, one thing is that it increases your blood sugar level and it increases the oxygen level in your blood. Let's go back to what we said earlier. You're going to want higher levels of energy circulating in your blood, accessible energy, so that your muscles can kind of take that up and use it to keep you doing what you need to do. And also your muscles need oxygen to work. So when we have these higher levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine in our blood, or also known as adrenaline if you'd prefer, that chemical increases the blood sugar in your body and in your blood and increases the oxygen in your blood. So we're getting that stuff to your essential organs. Another thing adrenaline does is it helps shut down those non-essential systems like digestion that I talked about earlier. Epinephrine and norepinephrine play a really important role in that. The third one, which we haven't really, actually I guess we did talk about, is that idea of pain. Adrenaline is pretty important in damping down your sense of pain, which we want to make sure we don't get distracted by it. So that's what's going on with your adrenal gland. It's releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now let's talk about a different gland, which is your pituitary gland. As part of a separate pathway, the pituitary gland produces a hormone called ACTH. Okay? When ACTH is at higher levels in your bloodstream, it causes that adrenal gland to secrete cortisol and aldosterone. Okay, so let me make sure. This is why the adrenal gland is listed on here twice, is because its own thing it does is to release epinephrine. It also, once the pituitary gland has been going for a while, will start to release cortisol and aldosterone. And the thing that drives the adrenal gland to release cortisol and aldosterone is specifically the levels of ACTH that you find in your blood. Those levels of ACTH get higher because the pituitary gland, when you're in a fight or flight mode, will release ACTH. Okay, so that's the only thing that we need to know that ACTH does, is it stimulates the adrenal gland to release cortisol and aldosterone. So let's talk about what cortisol and aldosterone do. Cortisol leads to converting non-carbohydrates into sugars. Sugars are the quickest energy source for your body. So this is why we want an increase in cortisol during a fight or flight response. We want those non-carbohydrates turned into sugars and the sugars to get dumped into our bloodstream so that we can get quick energy to our muscles. Make sense? The other thing the adrenal gland is making in response to higher levels of ACTH is aldosterone. And this one we hadn't talked about yet. Aldosterone specifically increases water retention. Why would you want your body to increase water retention while you're in the middle of a fight or flight response? This one is actually about the texture, basically, I guess, and thickness of your blood. When you are in the middle of a fight or flight response, especially if you're going to go the fight route, you might get cut. And what you don't want is to bleed out, right? This would be dangerous if you are just gushing blood. So during the fight or flight response, aldosterone increases water retention. Increasing water retention thickens up your blood a little bit. And when you do get a cut, it's going to clot more quickly. So aldosterone is released specifically to help reduce bleeding while you're in the middle of a fight. Now, you don't always want your blood thicker, so we're going to want to have a process for kind of undoing all of this. But in the middle of the fight, having something that's going to clot your blood as fast as possible, that's going to keep less of it from bleeding out, is going to keep you a little bit safer. These are not the only hormones that are involved in the fight or flight response. These are not the only glands that are involved in releasing hormones, but these are the ones I want you to know about. Okay, we're going to stop there. And then in the next video, pick up with another one of these internal kinds of mechanisms.